The air in prickly pear flats tasted of grit. It was a fine, powdery dust that coated the tongue and settled in the lungs, a permanent souvenir of the parched land. The weekly market day amplified the settlement's natural perfume, adding the sharper notes of sweat-soaked leather, the metallic tang of rusting tools piled on canvas sheets, and the sour breath of cheap whiskey from the saloon's swinging doors. From the porch of that saloon, a banjo plinked a tune that had long since lost its way, each note a clumsy stumble in the oppressive afternoon heat. Ada Breyer stood on a makeshift platform, 3 warped planks laid over 2 barrels, and tried to disappear. At 22, she had mastered the art of making herself small, of drawing her shoulders in and lowering her gaze until she was nothing more than a shadow in a faded calico dress. But today, the sun was relentless, and there were no shadows to hide in. There was only the heat, the dust, and the circle of leering faces. Her uncle, Jedediah, stood beside her, his hand gripping her arm with the casual ownership of a man holding a tool. His voice, slick with false piety, cut through the market's low hum. "A good, strong girl," he announced, his words aimed at the collection of ranchers and prospectors. "Quiet, knows her place. A fine worker for any decent man's homestead. My own dear sister's child, left in my care. I have seen to her upbringing, and now it's time she repaid the kindness, a contract for her labor, to settle a debt of honor." The lie was as thick and cloying as molasses. The kindness had been a cold corner in a barn, and the upbringing had been endless work and a litany of her failings, the worst of which, the one that had finally seen her cast out from the last vestiges of family, was a whispered rumor that had grown into a shouted condemnation barren. A woman who could not bear children was a dead branch on a family tree, a field that would yield no crop. Useless. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the small crowd. They had all heard the rumors. A beefy rancher with a florid face and a silver-buttoned vest stepped forward, stroking his chin. His name was Silas Croft, a man known for his smooth talk and his hard bargains. "A quiet worker, you say?" Jedediah Croft's voice was oily. "What's a man to pay for a shadow in his kitchen? She don't look like much, all bone and fright. I'll offer $20 for a year's contract. She can mend fences and serve my table. Won't have to worry about her getting any distracting ideas." He winked at the crowd, and another wave of snickers followed. The implication was clear. A barren woman was safe to have around. Uncomplicated. Ada flinched as if struck. $20, the price of a decent saddle blanket. She felt the familiar, hot shame rise in her throat, a feeling she had swallowed so many times it had become a part of her. She focused on a loose thread on her sleeve, a tiny anchor in a swirling sea of humiliation. From the deep shade of the general store's overhanging porch, a man watched. He stood apart from the others, a figure of stillness in the market's restless energy. He was tall, his frame lean but broad at the shoulders, dressed in dusty, functional clothes that had been worn and mended many times. A wide-brimmed hat, stained by sun and sweat, was pulled low, casting his face in permanent shadow. This was Colt Harrow, the solitary owner of a struggling ranch up on Dry Willow Ridge, a place most folks avoided. They said the wind there spoke to him, and that he rarely spoke back. His eyes, when the light caught them, seemed coated with a fine haze, like a landscape seen through a morning fog. He had been watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. As Croft reached into his pocket, preparing to seal his demeaning bargain, Colt Harrow pushed himself away from the post he'd been leaning on. He moved without hurry, his worn boots making little sound in the thick dust. He didn't approach the platform, but walked directly to the small, rickety table where Jedediah had set his ledger. Without a word, he took a heavy leather pouch from his belt and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that cut through the banjo music and the laughter. The sound was heavy with the weight of silver coins. "She doesn't belong on this block," Colt Harrow said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a rough, gravelly quality that commanded attention. like the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. Jedediah stared at the pouch, his greedy eyes wide. He quickly untied the drawstring and peered inside. His breath hitched. It was far more than $20. It was more than he could have hoped for. Silas Croft bristled. "Here now, Harrow, I made an offer. We were conducting business." Colt didn't even glance at him. His gaze was fixed on Jedediah. "Your business is concluded." Jedediah, fumbling to secure the pouch, gave a weak, wheezing chuckle. He avoided looking at Ada. "Well, now, a fine price. A fine price. But you understand, there's no guarantee on the goods, no warranty, so to speak." For the first time, Colt Harrow's head lifted just enough that his eyes became clear of the hat's shadow. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they were as cold as a winter sky. He looked past Jedediah and his eyes met Ada's for a fleeting, searing moment. Then he looked back at the uncle. "From now on," he said, his voice low and flat, "no one puts a price on her again." The statement hung in the hot, still air. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the dust. Jedediah paled and took a clumsy step back, clutching his silver. The crowd grew quiet, the sport suddenly over. Silas Croft scowled, but said nothing more. There was something about Colt Harrow, a coiled stillness, that discouraged argument. Colt gave a slight nod toward the wagon hitched near the store. "Get your things." Ada's hands trembled as she stepped down from the platform, her legs unsteady, her things. The word was a mockery. She clutched the small, thin cloth sack she held, the only object in the world that was truly hers. Inside was a worn wooden comb that still held the scent of the lavender water her mother used to use, a small, leather-bound notebook filled with her own thoughts and sketches of wildflowers, and a faded, frayed scrap of blue ribbon. It had been her mother's. It was everything she had left of a life before this one. She walked toward the wagon, her eyes fixed on the ground, feeling the stares of the townsfolk like physical blows. As she passed Colt, he didn't look at her, but simply turned and began untying the wagon's reins. The journey out of Prickly Pear Flats was a gauntlet of silent judgment. As they passed the saloon, a group of cattle hands, their courage fortified by liquor, stumbled out onto the porch. One of them, emboldened by the pack, scooped up a handful of gravel and flung it in their direction. The small stones pattered against the side of the wagon bed. Ada flinched and squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable jeers. Colt Harrow didn't turn his head. He didn't slow the horse. His hands remained steady on the reins. "Keep your head low," he said, his voice calm and even, directed at the road ahead. "The wind will pass." And it did. The taunts faded behind them, swallowed by the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of the horse. The wagon jolted and swayed, its wheels finding every rock and rut in the sun-baked road. They crossed a dry creek bed, the wheels sinking into the soft sand with a groan, the horse straining to pull them up the opposite bank. With each jarring bump, Ada held onto the side of the wagon, her knuckles white. She watched the man beside her, his profile stark against the harsh landscape. He hadn't said another word. A question began to form in her mind, a cold knot of uncertainty. Had she been saved, or had she merely been transferred from one prison to another? This man was a stranger, a ghost from the shadows who had purchased her contract with a bag of silver. His motives were as hidden as his face beneath the brim of his hat. He had spoken of dignity, but this world had taught her that kindness always came with a price. She waited for him to demand it. Before them, the landscape opened up into a vast, unforgiving panorama. The long, jagged shadow of the Sierra Verde Mountains stretched across the horizon, a purple bruise against the pale sky. The earth was a burnt red, dotted with the skeletal shapes of saguaro cacti, their arms raised to the heavens as if in supplication or surrender. The sky itself was a brilliant, achingly high blue, a cold and indifferent expanse that offered no comfort. Only distance. This was his world. Dry Willow Ridge. Even the name sounded thirsty. After they had been traveling for what felt like an hour, the silence broken only by the wagon, he finally moved. He reached down beside his seat and picked up a metal canteen, holding it out to her without looking. "It's a long road," he said. "Save your breath." His tone was not unkind, but it was utterly practical, stripped of all pleasantry. Ada took the canteen, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who wrestled a living from this hard land. She drank, the lukewarm water tasting of metal and life. She took only a small sip before capping it and handing it back. The silence returned, stretching out with the road, but the question in her mind had grown too loud to ignore. It was a risk to speak, a risk to show curiosity, but the not knowing was a heavier burden. Why, the word was barely a whisper, so quiet she thought the wind might have carried it away. He didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the path, guiding the horse around a cluster of sharp rocks. For a moment, she was sure he would ignore her, that she had already broken some unspoken rule. Then he spoke. His answer was as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. "I need someone decent," he said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "More than I need someone perfect." Ada fell silent, the words settling into her. Decent, not strong, not obedient, not even hard-working. Decent. It was a word she hadn't heard applied to herself, or to anyone, in a very long time. It was a word that held a flicker of warmth, a startling and unexpected ember in the cold ash of her existence. As the wagon continued its slow, rattling journey toward the mountains, the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the land. The light caught the side of Colt Harrow's face at a new angle. For just a second, the brim of his hat no longer concealed the entirety of his temple. There, running from his hairline down toward his cheekbone, was a thin, white scar, an old mark left by a blade or a bullet. It was a silent testament to a past he didn't speak of, a history written on his skin. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low again, and the scar, along with the man's secrets, disappeared back into the shadow. The Harrow homestead was not a place of comfort. It was a place of endurance. It clung to the base of Dry Willow Ridge like a stubborn knot in an old piece of wood, braced against the persistent wind that swept down from the high slopes. As Colt reined the horse to a halt, the ranch announced itself not with a welcome, but with a series of stark, lonely sounds. The wind moaned as it found the gaps between missing planks in the barn wall. The rhythmic, weary squeak of a windmill turning somewhere out of sight was the ranch's unsteady heartbeat. And from a pole near the small, sun-bleached cabin, a wind chime made of cow vertebrae and ribs clacked together with a dry, hollow rattle. It was the music of a skeleton. The cabin itself was small, built of thick, weathered logs chinked with mud that had long since cracked and turned to dust. A stone chimney leaned slightly, as if tired of standing straight. The well was a circle of ancient, moss-speckled stones, its dark throat seeming to swallow the harsh sunlight. This was a place pared down to its essentials: water, shelter, and a wide, empty sky. As Colt stepped down from the wagon, a creature emerged from the shade of the porch. It was a dog, old and grizzled, with a coat the color of dried moss and sagebrush. One of its ears drooped, and its hips were narrow with age, but its tail gave a slow, hopeful thump-thump-thump against the wooden porch steps. "This is Moss," Colt said. His first words since they'd left the flats. He didn't look at Ada, but at the dog, his voice softening by a fraction. "He's the real owner of this place? I just do the work." Moss padded over, sniffed at Ada's worn shoes, and then looked up at her with cloudy, intelligent eyes. She tentatively reached down a hand, and the dog leaned into her touch, his rough fur a surprising comfort. There was a history of loneliness in the animal's quiet greeting. Colt gestured toward the cabin. "The loft is yours." There's a mattress and blankets. Water's in the barrel by the door." He began to unhitch the horse, his movements economical and precise. It was clear he was not a man who wasted motion or words. Ada understood she had been dismissed. The inside of the cabin was as stark as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 benches, a cast-iron stove, and a few shelves holding tin plates and utensils made up the furnishings. Everything was clean, but worn. There was no clutter, no decoration, save for a single calendar hanging from a nail on the wall. It was a promotional calendar from a grain supplier in a town she didn't recognize. As she passed it, her eyes caught on the current month. Several dates were circled, and beside one, a note was scrawled in thick, deliberate letters, "Water fee due." The ink was a stark, angry red, a small drop of blood on the pale page, a silent warning of a debt that could not be ignored. The few seasonal hands Colt might have once employed, she guessed, had long since been driven off by the drought that had its thumb pressed firmly on the entire territory. This was a one-man, one-dog operation, and it was struggling. Their first dinner was a silent affair. Colt moved around the small kitchen with a familiar, if ungraceful, competence. He served up a meal of cornbread and beans. The bread was burnt around the edges, with a bitter, smoky taste. The beans were heavy with salt, a desperate attempt to add flavor where there was none. Ada ate without complaint, grateful for any food that she hadn't had to beg or steal. Colt ate with a focused intensity, his eyes on his plate. He finished quickly, then took his own plate, scraped the remaining beans onto it, and set it on the floor. Moss padded over and began to eat with the quiet dignity of old age. The gesture was so simple, so unthinking. It told Ada more about Colt Harrow than an hour of conversation could have. He was a man who took care of what was his, even in the smallest of ways. That evening, he gave her a pile of laundry to wash, a task she accepted with a nod. Among the items was a heavy wool blanket, thick with the dust of a long winter. As she worked the lye soap into the coarse fibers in a wooden basin outside, her fingers snagged on something. She turned the blanket over and found a crudely mended tear. The stitches were large and uneven, the thread thick and black against the gray wool. It was the work of a man's hands, clumsy but determined, a person trying to hold things together, alone. She imagined him sitting by the fire on a cold night, squinting in the dim light, wrestling with a needle and thread, a task for which he was not made but which necessity demanded. She carefully washed around the patch, a strange and unexpected tenderness welling up inside her. Someone had been trying to mend a broken world, one clumsy stitch at a time. When she was finished, Colt was nowhere to be seen. The wind had picked up, carrying the clean, sharp, resinous scent of the creosote bushes that dotted the landscape. It was the perfume of the desert after a long, hot day. Ada climbed the ladder to the small loft. There, as promised, was a mattress stuffed with fresh, sweet-smelling straw and a stack of clean, if threadbare, blankets. After years of sleeping on the hard-packed earth of barn floors and the cold flagstones of storerooms, the simple comfort of it felt like an unimaginable luxury. She lay down, pulling a thin blanket up to her chin, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she fell asleep without the gnawing fear of being kicked or cursed at in the morning. Morning came early, the first rays of sun slanting through the cracks in the cabin walls. The smell of coffee was already in the air. Colt was by the barn, and he motioned for her to come over. A section of the corral door was sagging, its rope hinge frayed and broken. "We'll use a harrow knot here," he said, holding up a length of new rope. He didn't ask if she knew how to tie knots. He simply began to teach her. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising dexterity, looping the rope over and under, pulling it tight in a complex pattern she couldn't follow. Watch again. He undid it and started over, slower this time. He had her try, his patience a quiet, solid thing as her fingers fumbled with the stiff rope. It took her 4 tries, but when she finally pulled the final loop tight, the knot held firm and elegant. Her palms were raw and red from the friction, the first hint of blisters already forming. But she looked at her work, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She had learned something new. She had made something that held. Later that morning, he led the horse from its stall to be re-shod. As he prepared his tools, he ran a hand down the horse's leg, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur. He showed Ada how to lift the hoof, how to brace it between her knees, how to check for stones or cracks. "Go slow," he instructed, his voice low. "A horse can feel a man's heart pound through his hands. They know when you're scared. You have to be calmer than they are." He tapped the hoof gently. "You listen to the horse, and it'll listen to you." He spoke of the animal with a respect he didn't seem to have for people. While he worked, Ada noticed a long tear in the shoulder of his canvas work coat, the fabric frayed and threatening to give way completely. That afternoon, while he was out checking the water levels in the troughs, she took the coat from the hook where it hung, with her own small sewing kit from her cloth sack. She sat on the porch steps, Moss resting his head on her lap. She chose a strong, fine thread, and her stitches were the opposite of the ones on the blanket. They were small, neat, and precise, a double line of reinforcement that was nearly invisible. It was a skill her mother had taught her, a way of making things whole again. When she was done, the seam was stronger than the original fabric. She hung the coat back on the hook, the mended tear a silent secret between them, a small act of care offered into the vast silence of the homestead. The next day, they worked together, resetting a line of fence posts that had been loosened by the wind and the shifting, dry soil. The work was hard, digging new holes in the baked earth, tamping the posts until they were solid. Colt worked with a tireless, rhythmic energy. He showed her how to use her weight on the tamping rod, how to sight along the line to keep the posts straight. At one point, to measure the distance for the next post. Ada, without thinking, used a method her carpenter father had taught her. She stretched her arms out wide, her fingertips marking the span, and walked heel to toe to the next spot. It was an odd, almost dance-like movement in the middle of the dusty pasture. She looked up to see Colt watching her, a strange expression on his face. And then it happened. A low chuckle started deep in his chest, and for the first time, a real smile broke through the fog of his usual stoicism. It was a brief, startling sound, as unexpected as a wildflower blooming from a rock. The smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and momentarily erasing the weariness that lived there. The moment passed as quickly as it came, and he turned back to his work. But the air between them had changed. A small piece of the wall around him had crumbled. That afternoon, during a brief rest from the sun, Ada sat in the shade of the cabin and took out her small notebook and a nub of charcoal. She wrote a single line in her neat, careful script. Small jobs are also fires when gathered. They create warmth. As evening descended, a deep purple shadow creeping down from the ridge, the day's work was done. The windmill continued its tireless, creaking song. They sat on the top step of the porch, a few feet apart, watching the last of the sun's orange glow fade from the sky. They didn't speak. There was no need. The silence was no longer empty or awkward. It was a shared space, filled with the rhythm of their breathing, which had, without either of them noticing, fallen into a comfortable, matching cadence. She looked at the man beside her, the strong, silent rancher who had bought her contract and then taught her his family's knot. He hadn't offered her pity, or false comfort, or empty promises. He had offered her work to do, a roof over her head, and the quiet dignity of being treated as a capable human being. Ada realized then that his silence wasn't a wall to keep her out. It wasn't coldness or indifference. It was an invitation, as clear as any spoken word. It was a quiet, steady space where she didn't have to pretend, or apologize, or make herself small. In the immense, quiet world of Colt Harrow, she was simply allowed to just be you, the silence seemed to say, and for Ada Breyer, that was the most profound kindness of all. The rhythm of life at the Harrow homestead was dictated by the sun and the thirst of the land. It was a life of repetitive tasks, a constant battle against decay and drought. Yet, within this stark framework, Ada began to cultivate small pockets of warmth, tiny victories that slowly pushed back the loneliness that clung to the place like the ever-present dust. It started with Moss. The old dog had taken to following her everywhere, a silent, four-legged shadow. One morning, as Colt was preparing to ride out, he dropped one of his thick leather work gloves near the porch. Ada, seeing an opportunity, picked it up and called to the dog. "Moss, bring it here, boy." She made a game of it, tossing the glove a few feet away, her voice light and encouraging. At first, the old dog simply looked at her, his cloudy eyes full of gentle confusion. But Ada was patient. She knelt, tapped the ground, and repeated the game. Finally, a flicker of an old instinct sparked within him. He patted over, nudged the glove with his nose, and then, ever so gently, picked it up in his soft mouth and trotted back to her, his tail giving a proud, sweeping wag. From that day on, it became their ritual. Colt would intentionally leave a glove, and Moss would dutifully act as the courier, carrying it from the barn to the kitchen or from the porch to the well, a furry, self-important messenger. Ada would praise him lavishly, and the old dog would soak it in. Colt never commented on it directly, but Ada would often catch him watching from a distance, a barely perceptible softening around his mouth as he observed the quiet joy that now connected his home's two other inhabitants. The silent, working ranch now had a current of gentle humor running through it. Ada's ingenuity began to seep into other corners of their life. The water from the well was clean, but had a flat, mineral taste, remembering a trick an old Apache woman had shared with her mother. Ada took her knife and carefully sliced several pads from a prickly pear cactus. She burned off the spines in the fire until the green skin was blackened and blistered, then peeled them and steeped the smoky flesh in hot water. The resulting tea was strange, greenish-brown and carrying a bitter, earthy taste, but it was surprisingly refreshing, cutting through the dust in their throats in a way plain water never could. She poured a cup for Colt when he came in from the midday sun. His face caked with grime. He took the tin cup, eyed the liquid suspiciously, and took a cautious sip. He swirled it in his mouth for a moment, his expression unreadable. Ada held her breath. He swallowed, then took another, longer drink. He set the cup down and gave a single, curt nod. "Gets the job done," was all he said, but for Colt Harrow, that was high praise. He drank cactus tea every day after that. Her calm competence proved itself again when a new batch of calves fell victim to a nest of fire ants. Their legs were swollen and dotted with angry red welts, and their distressed lowing filled the air. Colt was preparing a harsh poultice of mud and lye when Ada intervened. "Wait," she said, her voice firm but quiet. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a jug of apple cider vinegar and a clean rag. She diluted the vinegar with water and, speaking in a low, soothing tone to the agitated animals, began to gently wash their bites. The calves, sensing her calm, eventually stood still for her ministrations. The acidic vinegar neutralized the ant venom, and within an hour, the swelling had gone down and the calves were quiet, contentedly nursing from their mothers. Colt watched her, his hands on his hips, and said nothing, but he put the lye away. The drought meant that any meat they couldn't eat immediately had to be preserved. Colt's method was to simply hang long strips of beef from the rafters in the barn, where they were vulnerable to insects and dust. One afternoon, Ada went to work with a saw, a hammer, and a handful of nails she'd found in an old coffee can. Using a design she remembered from her father's workshop, she built a simple but effective drying rack. It was a tall, narrow frame with several levels of crossbars, which she then draped with cheesecloth. The design allowed air to circulate freely while keeping the meat clean. When Colt saw it, he stopped and walked around the structure, running a hand over the rough-sawn wood. He tested its sturdiness, then examined the way the cheesecloth was tied down. Saved half a season's worth of work and worry, he admitted, his voice low with something that sounded like wonder. It was another small victory, another piece of order she had created out of the ranch's prevailing chaos. One afternoon, the sky to the west turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A low wall of brown cloud was rolling toward them, a sight that made the air grow still and heavy with dread. "Dust storm," Colt said, his voice tight as he began securing the shutters on the cabin. "Get inside." But Ada's eyes were on the calf pen. The young animals were skittish, their heads raised to the foul-smelling wind. She ignored his order and ran to the water barrel, soaking several clean feed sacks. As the first gust of wind hit, carrying a stinging blast of sand, she was already in the pen, calmly tying the damp cloths loosely over the noses and mouths of the terrified calves. They struggled at first, but she was gentle, murmuring to them as she worked. When the storm hit in full force, plunging the world into a howling, brown twilight, the calves were protected from the worst of the choking dust that could so easily inflame their delicate lungs. She stayed with them through the worst of it, her own face covered, a solid, calming presence in the gale. After the storm passed, leaving a thick blanket of silt on every surface, Colt found her brushing the dust from the animals' coats. He looked from the calm, breathing calves to the woman who had stood her ground to protect them. He didn't offer thanks, not in words. Instead, he took the brush from her hand and started working on the calf beside hers, sharing the task in a silence that was more eloquent than any speech. It was in the quiet evenings that Ada's keen eyes noticed something else. The ranch's water was supplied by a main irrigation ditch maintained by a regional monopoly, the Cactus Line Water Company. Every homesteader paid a steep fee for their allotted share. She noticed that while the flow seemed adequate during the day, it dwindled to a near trickle after sunset. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a symptom of the ever-present worry about water. But she started watching it, marking the water level on a rock at dusk and then again at dawn. Every morning, the level was significantly lower than it should have been. This observation awakened a part of her she hadn't used in years, the meticulous, methodical mind of a carpenter's daughter. She took out her notebook and, using charcoal, began to map the ditch as it ran through the Harrow property. She drew clean lines and sharp angles, using arrows to indicate flow, adding numbers to mark the water levels she measured, and noting the exact times of her observations. The page began to fill with data, a quiet but damning indictment of the water company. Her notebook, once a sanctuary for her thoughts and feelings, was becoming a ledger of evidence. One evening, after she had spent an hour by the ditch, making notes in the fading light, she returned to the cabin to find Colt cleaning a firearm at the table. It was an old cap-and-ball pistol, heavy and beautifully made, but clearly antiquated. He worked with a focused, reverent care, oiling the mechanism until it moved with a smooth, quiet click. When he was finished, he didn't put it away. He looked at her, his expression serious in the flickering lamplight. He pushed the pistol across the table toward her. "This was my father's." Ada looked at the gun, then back at him, confused. "It's for you," he said. He held up a hand to stop her protest. "Not to use. I don't expect you to ever fire it. I want you to have it so you know the weight of it, so you understand what it means to be responsible for something that can cause great harm, or protect what's precious." He tapped the heavy barrel with his finger. "Responsibility has a weight you can feel in your hand. I want you to know it." Ada reached out and hesitantly wrapped her fingers around the grip. The pistol was cold and surprisingly heavy. It felt alien in her hand, a tool of finality in a life that had become about mending and building. But she understood his meaning. It was not a weapon he was giving her. It was a burden of trust. A few nights later, Ada hung a small brass bell she'd found in a discarded tackle box from the top hinge of the main gate. "So we can hear if anyone comes," she explained. That night, as the wind picked up, the bell began to ring. A tiny, tinny sound in the vast darkness. It wasn't a visitor, just the wind. But as they lay in their separate beds, listening, the sound connected them. They were no longer just two individuals under one roof. They were a garrison of two, listening to the same sounds, alert to the same world. The trust between them deepened in these quiet moments. One evening, Ada took out her notebook and, by the light of the oil lamp, began to read aloud. The words were not her own, but lines she had painstakingly copied from a tattered book of poems by a man named Walt Whitman, which a kind schoolteacher had given her years ago. Her voice was soft, but clear in the quiet cabin. This is the meal equally set. This is the meat for natural hunger. It is for the wicked just the same as the righteous. I make appointments with all. I will not have a single person slighted or left away. She read for several minutes, the powerful, strange words filling the small space. When she finished, she looked up at Colt. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her. "I'm not a man for letters," he said, his voice rough with an unfamiliar emotion. "I don't understand all those words, but I understand the way you read them." A few nights after that, Ada used the last of their apples and a small ration of flour to bake a small pie. It was a humble thing, but the smell of baked apples and cinnamon filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She cut it into 2 pieces and set them on the table, without a word. Colt used his fork to push the slightly larger piece toward her plate. His eyes never met hers. They stayed fixed on the steady, golden flame of the oil lamp, as if the simple act of generosity was too intimate to be acknowledged directly. Later that night, before she blew out her own small candle in the loft, Ada opened her notebook. She didn't write about the water ditch or the dust storm. She wrote a simple observation, a truth she had discovered not in a book, but in the quiet actions of the man downstairs. A good man rarely makes promises. He fixes the door hinge. Mesquite Ferry was a different kind of town than Prickly Pear Flats. The dust was the same, but the ambition was sharper. This was not a place for desperate bargains. It was a place for hard-nosed commerce, a central hub where ranchers came for supplies. Cattlemen made deals, and, most importantly, everyone came to pay fealty to the Cactus Line Water Company, whose main office dominated the dusty thoroughfare. Ada felt the tension in her shoulders as they tied the wagon. This was her first time in a proper town since the day Colt had bought her contract. She wore a simple, clean dress she had mended herself and a plain bonnet to shield her from the sun and, she hoped, from the stairs. Colt, beside her, was a tower of his usual silence. He carried a list, his focus solely on the provisions they needed to survive the coming month. They entered the Mercantile, a long, cavernous room that smelled of new canvas, oiled leather, and pipe tobacco. It was crowded. As Colt moved toward the counter with his list, Ada felt a cold dread wash over her. Standing near the back, by the saloon doors, was her uncle, Jedediah. He was with the same swaggering cattle drovers who had thrown gravel at her wagon. Jedediah saw her. His eyes, small and dark, narrowed with a familiar, reptilian spite. He didn't speak to her, but leaned into one of the drovers, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Well, I'll be," he sneered, loud enough for all to hear. "Some men will find a use for just about anything, even a dry tree that'll never bear fruit." The drovers let out a braying laugh. Ada flinched, the color draining from her face. It was the old shame, the one word that had defined her barren, useless. She felt the eyes of the entire store turn to her, the whispers starting up like dry leaves skittering across a floor. She instinctively took a step back, wanting to retreat to the safety of the wagon, to the silent, non-judgmental company of moss. Before she could move, a new voice, sharp and syrupy, cut through the whispers. "Can I help you, dear?" Ada turned. Behind the fabric counter stood a woman in her 40s, with hair pulled back so tightly it made her eyes bulge. Her dress was fussy, adorned with lace that looked out of place in the dusty town. This was Mara Quill, the owner of the mercantile and the town's primary source of gossip. We need to credit this," Ada said, her voice barely a whisper. She held up a small sack of sugar she had brought from the homestead. It had weevils. Mara Quill's painted-on smile didn't reach her eyes. She recognized Ada from the rumors that had drifted in from Prickly Pear. "Well, now," Mara said, her voice dripping with false concern, "you must be the new acquisition up at Dry Willow Ridge. I must say, you've made quite the impression." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Some of the women folk are saying you have a gift, that you can get a man to do anything, just with those eyes." She tapped a long fingernail on the counter. "They say it's a kind of charm, not a Christian kind of charm, if you take my meaning." This was worse than her uncle's insult. This was a new poison, one that painted her as a temptress, a witch. The whispers in the store grew louder, more pointed. The Ada who had stood on the platform in Prickly Pear Flats would have dissolved into tears. But this was the Ada who had mended fences, taught an old dog new tricks, and plotted the flow of water by moonlight. She straightened her back. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She placed the sack of sugar on the counter with a quiet thump. "The sugar has weevils," she repeated, her voice steady and clear. "Please credit the Harrow account for it, and I need to record our debt for these new supplies." She held out the list. Her hand was not shaking. Mara, incensed at being denied the spectacle of a breakdown, bristled. "We don't just take back opened goods, and we certainly don't extend credit to every—" "Just note the debt," Ada said. She met Mara's gaze, and for the first time, her eyes held no fear, only a cool, quiet resolve. The calm in her voice was more powerful than a shout. The crowd, which had been pressing in for the entertainment, grew quiet. They had expected a scene, a tearful, hysterical woman. They were given a bookkeeper. Ada's dignity was a stunning, unexpected countermove. At that moment, a commotion near the front of the store drew everyone's attention. A portly, well-dressed man was shaking hands with another man who wore a black suit and a stern, judicial expression. Judge Pike, the portly man, boomed, clapping the judge on the back. "A pleasure to have you in Mesquite Ferry. You must be parched. The law is thirsty work, and I am a servant of this town." Ada recognized the portly man instantly. Malachi Dern, the owner of the Cactus Line Water Company. He was exactly as she had pictured him, slick, overfed, and drenched in the false sweat of a man who never labored. Judge Avery Pike, the circuit judge, looked mildly uncomfortable with the public display. "Mr. Dern, I am here on official business." Of course, Dern laughed, steering him toward the saloon. "But first, a refreshment, as a gesture of the town's hospitality." As Dern and the judge moved past, Ada's eyes were drawn to the alcove that served as the water company's office. On the desk, an imposing leather-bound ledger was open. It was the public registry of water allocation and payments. Ada's heart began to pound, while Mara was occupied with another customer, still fuming. Ada drifted closer, her gaze sweeping the open page. It was exactly as she'd suspected. The columns were neat. Allocation Harrow, C, payment received. But then she saw the other columns, daytime flow rate and nighttime flow rate. The daytime numbers were steady, matching the allocation, but the nighttime numbers, even in the official ledger, were recorded as being a full 30% lower. Dern wasn't just stealing the water. He was logging the reduced flow, hiding his theft in plain sight. No doubt blaming it on evaporation or repairs. Her notebook wasn't a suspicion. It was the missing half of his own confession. She was staring at the proof, her mind racing, when a shadow fell over her. "Spying now? Are we?" Mara Quill's voice was venomous. She was furious at being dismissed, furious at the scene Dern had just stolen from her. She needed to reclaim control. "Thinking of adding theft to your list of talents." And before Ada could react, Mara's hand shot out and yanked the bonnet from her head. The store went utterly silent. It was a shocking, intimate violation. Ada's hair, pinned neatly, came partially undone, a few strands falling around her face. She froze, the bonnet dangling from Mara's hand, her humiliation complete and absolute. Her uncle and the drovers grinned, sensing the kill. Then, a sound. Thud. It was a soft sound, just the sound of felt on wood, but it cut through the silence like a cannon shot. Colt Harrow had moved from the door. He had walked past his wagon load of supplies, past the grinning drovers, and past Ada. He stood directly in front of Mara Quill. He had taken off his wide-brimmed hat, his armor, and placed it, brim down, on her counter. He wasn't looking at Mara. He was looking at the wall behind her, as if she were too insignificant to merit his gaze. The scar on his temple was stark white in the dim light of the store. When he spoke, his voice was the quiet rumble of a rock slide. The dust storm, last week. Mara's triumphant sneer wavered. The one that tore the roof off the feed store, Colt continued, his voice flat. The one that suffocated half of Silas Croft's herd against his own fence line. He paused, and for the first time, he turned his head and looked at Ada, who stood frozen, her bonnet still in Mara's hand. Then he looked back at Mara. She is the reason my ranch is still standing. She is the reason my calves are still breathing. It was not a defense. It was a fact. He wasn't defending her honor. He was stating her worth, a worth measured in survival. In life, he was acknowledging her not as a possession, but as a partner. Malachi Dern, his political instinct sensing a shift in power, stepped away from the judge. He let out a condescending chuckle. My, Harrow, a touching speech. But a ranch hand saving a calf doesn't change the law of this territory. And the law here is very simple. He spread his arms wide, a gesture of absolute ownership. My water, my law. This broke Ada's paralysis. The shame was burned away by a sudden, cold anger. She had the data. She had the truth. She stepped forward, her eyes clear and bright, locking on Dern. She ignored Mara completely. The law doesn't favor the dark Mr. Dern, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as sharp and thin as a new blade. Dern was stunned into silence. This girl, this barren scrap, was challenging him publicly. Judge Pike stepped into the center of the room, his face now a mask of judicial severity. He understood this was no longer a petty store quarrel. That is a serious accusation. Miss, he said, his voice hard. Mr. Dern is a pillar of this community. You speak of the dark. That implies secrets. He looked from Dern's flushed, angry face to Ada's pale, determined one. The law, as you rightly say, does not favor the dark. It deals in evidence, in proof. Do you have any? Ada clutched the small, leather-bound notebook that was tucked in her apron pocket. She could feel the charcoal-smudged pages through the thin fabric. This was not the place. Not yet. We will find the proof. Judge, she said, her voice unwavering. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. The cattle drovers, seeing their benefactor challenged, began to shoulder their way forward, their expressions menacing. One of them, the same one who had thrown the gravel, spat on the floor and put his hand on his belt, near his holster. A low, vibrating sound rumbled through the floorboards. It was Moss. The old dog had risen from his spot by the door. He stood at Colt's side, his grizzled muzzle lifted, his teeth not bared, but the growl in his chest was the sound of pure, restrained warning. The drover froze. Colt Harrow did not look at the drover. He did not look at Dern. He reached out and picked his hat up from the counter. He settled it back on his head, the familiar shadow falling over his face. He bent, picked up the new sack of sugar, and then walked to the large, ornamental saddle that was on display near the door. As he passed it, he simply rested his calloused hand on the saddle's horn for a beat. A simple, proprietary touch. It was not a threat. It was a statement of immovable presence. He was not a man to be pushed. The drovers, suddenly faced with a silent, immovable man and his very serious dog, visibly deflated. The aggression drained out of them, leaving only shuffling feet and averted eyes. Colt turned to Ada and gave a single, slight nod toward the door. Ada walked over to Mara Quill. Mara, pale and shaken, was still holding the bonnet. Her victory turned to ash. Ada gently took the bonnet from her unresisting fingers. She did not put it on. She held it in her hand. Then, with her spine as straight as a new fence post and her head held high, she walked out of the mercantile and into the cleansing sunlight. Colt followed, Moss at his heel. As the door swung shut, the whispers erupted behind them, but they were no longer whispers of mockery or scorn. They were the confused, startled whispers of a town that had just witnessed something it didn't understand. It was the sound of wind catching on a barbed wire fence, a sound of curiosity, and a new, unfamiliar hint of fear. The night on Dry Willow Ridge was not silent. It was a tapestry of tiny, anxious sounds. The wind, which had been a steady moan all day, now came in fitful, whispering gusts, rattling the bone chime by the cabin with a dry, hollow clatter. And then there was the sound of the water. They were hidden in a deep washout about 30 yards from the main irrigation ditch, a place choked with sagebrush and skeletal gray thorns. Colt lay flat on the lip of the gully, a dark, unmoving shape, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. Ada was tucked just below him, her body pressed against the cold, sandy earth. Moss was a solid, warm presence at her side, his head resting on his paws, his old ears twitching at every snap of a distant twig. The sound from the ditch was all wrong. During the day, it was a healthy, full-throated gurgle. Now, it was a thin, metallic hiss, like a dying snake. It was the sound of a place being slowly starved. Ada had brought her tools. From her pocket, she retrieved a stick of tallow candle, unused, and her charcoal pencil. She crept from the washout, moving as low as a shadow, and slipped down to the water's edge. Colt watched, every line of his body tensed, ready to move. She found a spot where the bank was soft and jammed the candlestick deep into the mud, a perfect, makeshift measuring rod. The water licked at its base, leaving a damp, dark line. She marked it with her charcoal, then added a small notation for the time. Just past midnight. Then she slid back into the gully, and they waited. The cold was the first enemy. It seeped up from the ground, finding its way through the thin fabric of her dress and the thicker wool of Colt's coat. They took turns watching, sharing a canteen of cold cactus tea, their movements slow and deliberate. An hour passed, then another. Ada slipped out, marked the candle again. The water level had dropped by a half-inch. She returned to the gully, her lips set in a grim line. She showed the new mark to Colt in the faint moonlight. He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving the ridge line. It was sometime after 2 in the morning when a sound that did not belong to the desert broke the quiet. It was the scrape of a boot on stone, coming from up ditch. Instantly, Colt's hand was on Moss's flank, a silent, heavy pressure. The dog's head lifted, but he made no sound. A figure detached itself from the deep shadows of a cluster of ocotillo. It was a man, short and wiry, moving with a furtive, practiced confidence. He carried no lantern. Navigating by moonlight alone, he stopped at a place where the ditch was overgrown with a thicket of brush, a spot they would have overlooked 100 times. The man knelt and began pulling the brush away, revealing not a patch of dirt, but a low, wooden panel set into the bank. Ada's breath caught in her throat. The man grunted with effort as he braced his foot and pulled a rusted iron lever. There was a low, sucking groan as a hidden sluice gate slid open. The sound of the water changed instantly. The thin hiss in their own ditch faded to a ghostly whisper, while a new, powerful rush of water began to pour from the bank. vanishing into a smaller, deeper channel that had been expertly concealed. It was being diverted, stolen, siphoned off into the darkness. Ada's hands were shaking, but not from cold. It was rage, cold and pure. She fumbled for her notebook. Her charcoal pencil flew across the page, her carpenter's daughter precision taking over. Time 2:14 a.m. Main ditch. She sketched the location. A simple, sharp map. Landmark Three Sisters Rock Outcrop. West. Action hidden gate opened. Flow diverted. She drew a thick black arrow pointing away from their ranch. The links of the chain were locking into place. She was so focused on her notes that it was Colt who heard it first. His hand clamped on her arm, pulling her head up. Hoofbeats, at least 2 horses, approaching at a steady walk from the direction of town. Down, Colt breathed, his voice barely a sound. He didn't pull her back into the gully. He pulled her forward, deeper into the thorny tangle of a massive yucca plant, its spiky leaves forming a dense, dark cage. They pressed their bodies flat to the ground, Colt shielding Ada with his own, his arm still heavy on Moss, who had begun a low, internal vibration, a growl too deep to be heard but which Ada could feel through the ground. A yellow, swinging circle of light appeared. A lantern. The riders were Dern's men, a night patrol. "Heard something," one of them said. "You're always hearing something," the other grumbled. "It's coyotes, or that hermit Harrow, crying over his empty ditch." The horses stopped not 20 feet from their hiding place. The man with the lantern dismounted. The light swept across the ground, painting the desert in stark, terrifying relief. It passed over the yucca, the sharp, sword-like leaves casting a net of black shadows across their faces. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. "Hold on," the first man said. He walked toward the ditch, the lantern held high. "Look here." The light fell on the bank, on the soft mud, on a set of small, clear boot prints. Ada's. "What'd I tell you?" the man said, a note of triumph in his voice. "Someone's been poking around." He crouched, bringing the lantern so close that Ada could smell the hot, oily tin. He was just on the other side of the yucca. Moss tensed under Colt's hand. The dog's body was rigid, his muzzle wrinkled in a silent snarl, and his entire frame was shaking with a desperate, agonizing effort to obey the command to be still. He wanted to protect them. He wanted to attack the light. And he was holding back with every ounce of his aged loyalty. The second rider spat. "It's probably just the Harrow woman, the one Dern warned us about. What's she gonna do, write him a stern letter?" "Dern said no one comes near the gates. He finds these tracks. He'll have our hides." He stood up, sweeping the light around one more time. It illuminated the gully they had hidden in earlier. "Nothing now. Let's check the lower gate and get back." They mounted up, their voices fading as they continued down the line, their lantern a bobbing, malevolent star. Ada and Colt didn't move for 5 long minutes. The silence that returned was heavier, more threatening. Finally, Colt let out a slow, controlled breath and released his grip on Moss. The old dog collapsed onto the sand, trembling from the release of tension. "We have what we need," Colt whispered, starting to move. "Wait," Ada breathed. She was staring past him, down the ditch, where the patrol had gone. Her eyes were fixed on a spot about 100 yards away. It was a place where a massive, ancient mesquite tree had been shattered by lightning years ago. Its trunk split and blackened. What Colt asked? "The moonlight, on the rocks, they're wet." He followed her gaze. She was right. There was a faint glimmer of moisture on a line of rocks far from the ditch, a place that should have been bone dry. She was already moving, her notebook in hand. They scrambled down the ditch line, keeping to the shadows. When they reached the broken mesquite, the reason for the patrol became clear. Tucked beneath the gnarled, exposed roots, almost completely submerged, was a second illegal gate. This one was older, more permanent, A solid iron wheel mechanism set in stone. This wasn't a minor diversion, it was a primary artery, siphoning off water before it even reached the section of the ditch their property drew from. This was industrial-scale theft. "He's not just stealing our share," Ada whispered, her voice thick with horrified understanding. "He's stealing from the main line. From everyone." She dropped to her knees, her fingers tracing the words in her notebook, her charcoal pencil moving with frantic speed. Time 3:30 a.m., second gate. Location under broken mesquite. Lightning struck. She pressed down, trying to capture the detail, the shape of the wheel, the direction of the hidden channel. In her haste, she pressed too hard, with a sharp click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. The charcoal tip snapped. A shout erupted from the darkness. There by the tree. The patrol, they hadn't moved on. They had been waiting. Ron Colt grabbed her, yanking her to her feet. The first gray, watery light of false dawn was beginning to touch the sky, turning the shadows from black to a pale, revealing purple. They were exposed. The men were on horseback. They were on foot. They couldn't outrun them on the open flats. Colt didn't even try. He shoved Ada toward the ridge. Up, go! He was guiding her toward the rotten cliff, the sheer face of the mesa that had been split by the same lightning that struck the tree. It was a treacherous, unstable wall of shale and crumbling sandstone. The horse, Ada remembered, pulling toward the gully where their horse was tethered. "No time!" Colt yelled. But Ada was already there, untying the knot, her hands fumbling. The horse snorted, its eyes white with fear at the sound of the approaching riders. "Give me the rein," Colt commanded. He grabbed the horse's lead, pushing Ada ahead of him. "You lead, I'm behind you." It was a climber's path, not a horse trail. Ada scrambled, pulling the panicked animal, her boots slipping on the loose shale. Colt was right behind, his hand on the horse's flank, half pushing it. His head turned to watch their pursuers, who had reached the base of the cliff and were dismounting, preparing to follow. Ada's foot slipped on a loose flat stone. The rock, no bigger than her hand, was dislodged. It skittered off the path, falling into the darkness. It wasn't a loud sound, just a clack-clack and then a heavier thwack as it struck a ledge far below. The shouting from below them stopped instantly. Ada and Colt froze, pressing themselves against the cliff face, the horse heaving beside them. In the stillness, they heard the voice of one of the men below, sharp with sudden fear. "Did you hear that the whole side of this thing is loose?" "He's trying to draw us into a rock slide," the other one yelled, his voice echoing up the cliff. "It ain't worth it. Dern can buy another horse." They heard the men scrambling back, the sound of their boots clumsy in their haste. A moment later, the sound of hoofbeats, galloping away, fast, in the direction of town. Ada leaned against the cold stone, her lungs burning, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stand. They had used the mountain's own deadly reputation as a shield. They didn't speak. They waited until the sun was a bright orange line on the horizon before leading the horse the long, slow way back to the homestead. They stopped not at the cabin, but at the drying rack Ada had built, its frame silhouetted against the new day. Ada's hands were scraped raw. She fumbled to open her notebook. The pages were damp from the night air and smudged with charcoal and dirt. She went to the cold fire pit near the porch, where a few embers still glowed deep in the ash. She found a flat stone that was still warm from the night's fire and carefully laid the notebook open on it, letting the gentle, dry heat bake the charcoal into the paper to set the evidence in stone. Colt stood watching her, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked at the maps, the arrows, the numbers, the carefully recorded times. He saw the broken stump of her charcoal pencil. He reached out and gently touched the page, his calloused fingertip tracing the arrow she had drawn from the broken mesquite. "It's enough," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "It's enough to make a judge listen." Ada looked up. Her bonnet was gone. Her hair was wild, and her face was streaked with grime, but her eyes were brighter and harder than he had ever seen them, and enough to make him furious. The night that followed their escape from the ridge was heavy with an unspent electrical charge. The adrenaline of the chase, the cold fear that had gripped them as they'd clung to the shale, had ebbed away, leaving behind a profound, vibrating exhaustion. But the air itself was different. The wind, usually a dry, hot blast that stole moisture and scoured the land, had shifted. It now came from the south, a soft, heavy breath that carried an almost forgotten smell, the clean, dark scent of distant rain. It was the smell of change, a promise of a future that wasn't parched and cracked. Inside the cabin, the silence was thicker than usual. They had eaten a cold meal of cornbread and jerky. The evidence, Ada's notebook, its charcoal drawings now dry and permanent, resting on the center of the table like a sleeping weapon. Moss was asleep by the hearth, twitching and whimpering, still running from Dern's men in his dreams. The single oil lamp on the table cast a small, brave circle of yellow light. Its flame danced and dipped with every gust of wind that pressed against the cabin walls, a tiny, unsteady pulse in the vast, waiting darkness. It mirrored the rhythm inside Ada's chest. Colt sat at the table, his back to her. He was attempting to clean his rifle, but his movements were stiff, his left hand clumsy. He had said nothing about the scrape on his forearm, the one she'd seen him get when he'd pushed the horse up the last incline. But as he worked the oil patch, she saw him wince, a sharp, involuntary tightening of his jaw. Ada rose from the hearth. She moved to the small shelf where she kept the homestead's meager medical supplies, a bottle of raw turpentine, a tin of axle grease for the wagon, and a small box containing a few precious, clean linen rags. She took one of the rags and the bottle of liniment intended for the livestock. She approached the table, her shadow merging with his in the lamplight. He heard her and stopped his work, but he did not turn. "You're hurt," she said. It was not a question. "It's a scratch," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The rock was sharp." "Let me—" He hesitated, his shoulders rigid. To allow this was an admission of weakness, a crack in the armor, but the exhaustion and the shared terror of the night had worn him down. He slowly turned on the bench, extending his left forearm, palm up. The scrape was long and angry, running from his wrist to his elbow, the skin raw and beaded with drying blood and grit. Ada set the lamp closer. She poured a small amount of the stinging liniment onto the rag and, without a word, gently began to clean the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath as the alcohol bit into the raw flesh. But he did not pull away. This was the first time she had touched him with such deliberate, focused care. Her fingers, themselves calloused from the rope and the well handle, moved with a surprising delicacy. She felt the landscape of his arm, the hard, ropey muscle beneath the skin, the ingrained dirt of a lifetime of work, and the shocking, profound warmth of him. As she dabbed at the edges of the wound, her fingertips brushed the unblemished, sun-darkened skin beside it. A tiny, inexplicable current, warm and bright, traveled from her hand up her arm. Settling in her chest, it was a spark of life, a quiet recognition that this man, who was a fortress of silence and shadow, was also made of warm, vulnerable flesh. She concentrated on the task, her head bowed, her hair falling forward to curtain her face. She wrapped the wound tightly with a fresh strip of linen, her movements precise and sure. Colt watched her. He watched the way the lamplight caught the reddish glint in her brown hair. He watched the serious, focused line of her mouth. He watched her slender fingers tie the knot, a gesture of mending that was so fundamentally a part of her. "There," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She smoothed the bandage one last time and began to pull her hands away. He did not let her. His right hand, his uninjured one, moved and covered hers, holding it against the new white bandage on his arm. Her hand was small and warm inside his. He just held it, for a second, 2 seconds. An eternity. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the wind and the faint click-clack of the bone chime outside. Then, slowly, he released her. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the light from the fire. He was still wearing his thick work gloves. With a deliberate, thoughtful motion, he pulled one off, finger by finger, then the other. He placed them on the table, side by side, like a surrendered pair of pistols. His hand went to his head. He paused, his fingers on the brim of the stained, wide-brimmed hat that was as much a part of him as his skin. It was his shield, his shadow, the barrier he kept between himself and the world. He lifted it from his head. He turned and walked the few steps to the narrow shelf by the door. He placed the hat on it. The gesture was as final and significant as a signature on a deed. He was setting down his defenses. He was laying down his armor. He turned back to face her. The lamplight fell fully on his face, illuminating the scar on his temple, the weary lines around his eyes, and the deep, unspoken loneliness that lived there. He was fully visible, exposed. He stood by the door. She stood by the hearth. The distance between them was only a few feet of wooden planking, but it was a canyon. The air between them was so charged, so still, it felt as if a single loud word would shatter it. There was only the sound of their breathing, his low and deep, hers shallow and quick. He looked at her, and his eyes held the question he would not, or could not, speak. It was not a demand, not the oily confidence of Silas Croft or the sneering dismissal of her uncle. It was not a claim. It was an offering. It was the look of a man who had been alone on a high, cold ridge for a very long time, and who had just seen, perhaps for the first time, a light in a distant window. His eyes asked, but they did not demand. He would not cross that space unless she invited him. He had given her the power. He had laid down his hat. Ada saw it all. She saw the risk he was taking, the pride he had set aside, and the fear she had lived with her entire life, the fear of being worthless, of being used, of being discarded rose up, a cold, familiar sickness. But then she looked at his hands, the ones that had taught her a knot. She looked at his arm, the one she had just bandaged. She looked at his eyes, the eyes that had watched her defend his calves in a dust storm. And the trust, the solid, heavy thing she had built up, day by day, small victory by small victory, was finally heavier than the fear. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The tension in his shoulders eased. He took one slow step toward her. He opened his mouth as if he needed to fill the silence, to make a promise, to explain the storm that was churning inside him. Ada raised her hand, palm out, stopping him. Words would break this. Words were for the outside world, for judges and thieves. This moment was for the silent language they had already perfected. "Don't speak," she murmured, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. "Just feel." She lowered her hand, turning it, palm up, and held it out to him, an invitation. She was not just accepting his question, she was leading him out of his solitude, guiding him into the small, warm circle of the lamplight. He took her hand. His was large and rough, a working man's hand, but it closed over hers with a surprising gentleness. He stepped forward until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He put his other arm around her, drawing her in. The embrace was not clumsy, nor was it crushing. It was firm, solid, and overwhelmingly gentle. It was the embrace of a man holding someone who had just been pulled from a freezing river, a man trying to share his own warmth. He held her as if she were both infinitely precious and desperately in need of protection from the storm they had just survived together. Ada let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her own hands, uncertain, came to rest on his chest. She leaned into him, letting her head rest against the solid wall of his torso. And she felt safe, utterly and completely safe. His chest rose and fell beneath her ear in a slow, steady rhythm. His heartbeat was not the frantic pounding of a man in fear, nor the agitated rhythm of a man in a hurry. It was a deep, dependable drumbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the windmill turning. It was the sound of the deep, old well. It was the sound of his home. His hand, the one on her back, rested lightly on the thin calico of her dress. It stopped there, his fingers spread wide. A silent, respectful pause. It was another question. May I? Ada gave him his answer. She pressed closer, melting into his strength, and turned her head, laying her cheek against the warm, rough skin of his neck. She closed her eyes. He smelled of the pine soap he used, of clean leather, and of the dry, dusty scent of the ridge itself. This was the smell of him. It was the smell of her life now. At her touch, his hand finally settled, pulling her flush against him, holding her as if he never intended to let her go. He lowered his head, and she felt his breath, warm and soft against her hair. He pulled back, just an inch, just enough to see her face. His hands, both of them, came up to cup her jaw, his calloused thumbs brushing the smudges of charcoal and exhaustion from her cheeks. His gaze was intense, searching, and filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. Then, he lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. It was slow. It was reverent. It was unhurried. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was the first rain on a dry land, a quiet affirmation that they were both, miraculously, still here. It was a thank you. It was a pledge. His lips were chapped and firm, and the kiss was simple and clean, and it shook her to the very foundation of her soul. Their breaths mingled, a shared, silent prayer against the storm outside. When the kiss ended, neither of them moved away. Ada, her hand still pressed against his chest, lifted one. She spread her fingers wide and laid her palm flat over his heart. She felt it, the steady, powerful beat, thump, thump, thump. It answered every doubt, every fear. It was the most honest thing she had ever felt. It spoke for him, saying everything he could not. I am here, I am real, I am steady. Colt covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his chest, as if to make sure she felt it, that she understood. They finally drew apart, but only by inches. Their foreheads came to rest against each other. They were sharing the same air, their eyes closed. A slow, radiant smile spread across Ada's face. It was the first truly unguarded smile she had given since childhood. Her eyes, when she opened them, were shining. The lamplight reflected in a shimmer of unshed, grateful tears. I'm here, she whispered, her voice husky. It was her own vow, an echo of his heartbeat. The tension that had held the cabin in its grip for hours finally, blessedly, broke. It drained away, leaving a deep, quiet calm in its place. He kept one of her hands in his and led her to the hearth. They sat down, not on the benches, but on the warm stones, their shoulders touching. He laced his fingers through hers, his rough, strong hand and her slender, capable one. They fit together perfectly. They sat for a long time, saying nothing, watching the fire burn down to red-gold embers. Outside, the wind quickened, and the click-clack of the bone chime became more insistent. The windmill continued its steady, creaking turn, its song no longer one of loneliness, but of companionship. The world was continuing on, but it was softer now. There were no loud promises made, no vows of forever. There was only the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of their intertwined hands, and the shared knowledge that they had faced the darkness and chosen to walk back into the light together. Ada's gaze drifted from the embers to the doorway, across the room, on the small wooden shelf. Colt's wide-brimmed hat sat in the shadows, still and quiet. It was a sentinel, a silent witness. It was the sign of a fortress that had lowered its drawbridge, of a heart that had finally been set down. safe in its own home. The warmth of the previous night had been a shelter, a private world built in the small space between a lamp and a hearth. But the dawn brought the cold, hard reality of the world they had defied. The notebook, resting on the table, was a physical object of their shared trust. But they both knew it was not enough. It was one man's word and one woman's data against the entire power structure of Mesquite Ferry. Malachi Dern did not just own the water. He owned the bank, the mercantile, and, if the rumors were true, the ear of the judge. "We have the what?" Ada said, her voice quiet in the morning cool. She touched the cover of the notebook. "We need the who. We need witnesses." Colt nodded, sipping his coffee. His newly bandaged arm was a stark white against his dark shirt. "Dern's men patrol that ditch. No rancher will risk his land to stand with us. Not yet." "Then we need people who aren't ranchers," Ada said, a new, hard clarity in her eyes. "We need people Dern can't easily threaten. People who believe in something other than money." Their first stop was the Mesquite Ferry Mission Clinic, a small, whitewashed adobe building that smelled of lye, dried herbs, and unwavering faith. Sister Rowan was not a gentle, beatific nun. She was a tall, gaunt woman in her 50s, with hands as calloused as Colt's and eyes that had seen too much drought and sickness to have any patience for foolishness. Ada laid her case out simply, without emotion. She didn't speak of theft or injustice. She spoke of data. "He's logging the flow as reduced in his own books," Ada explained, showing her the page from the ledger she had memorized. "He's hiding his theft by calling it a natural reduction. We need to prove the exact time the flow stops, and we need it verified by a source the whole town trusts." Sister Rowan tapped a long finger on the table. "And you believe that source is me?" "No, sister," Ada said. "It's your bell." The mission bell was the town's only clock. It rang at 6 in the morning for prayers, at noon for lunch, and at 6 in the evening for vespers. Its deep bronze dong was the metronome of their lives. "You want to borrow my bell?" the nun asked, skeptical. "I want to use its sound," Ada said. "If we can mark our measurements at the exact moment the 6 o'clock bell rings, and then again at 9, and again at midnight, we need a timestamp that no one, not even Judge Pike, can dispute." Sister Rowan was silent for a long time, staring at the small, earnest woman before her. Dern was a generous donor to the mission's charity fund, but Sister Rowan had also treated the children from the lower valley, the ones with coughs from the dust and distended bellies from the lack of clean water. "The bell rings for the glory of God," Sister Rowan said finally, her voice dry. "If the truth of the water is part of that glory, so be it, but I will not have my mission involved in a shooting war. Mr. Harrow." "There will be no guns," Colt said, his voice a low promise. "Only paper and ink." "Then you may listen for the bell," the sister agreed, giving a curt nod. "It will ring at 9 o'clock as well, for evening contemplation." It was the smallest of concessions, but it was a crack in Dern's armor. Their next stop was the one-room sheriff's office. Deputy Luz Ortega was writing a report at her desk, her black hair pulled into a severe, practical knot. She was a woman of few words, a native of the territory who had earned her badge through sheer, dogged competence and an unwillingness to be intimidated. She looked up as they entered, her dark, intelligent eyes taking in everything Colt's bandaged arm, Ada's new, steady gaze. Ada placed the notebook on the desk. "Deputy, we have evidence of water theft on the cactus line." Luz did not touch the book. She listened, her expression unchanging. As Ada recounted the events of the last 2 nights, the hidden gates, the patrol, the escape up the rotten cliff. When Ada was finished, Luz leaned back in her chair. "A good story," she said, her voice flat. "Your drawings are neat, Miss Breyer, but what I see here is your hand, your word, against Mr. Dern's entire company, as the law. I can't act on this." "We're not asking you to act," Colt said. "We're asking you to watch." Luz's eyes flickered to him. Watch what you two playing in the mud at midnight. We're going to do it again, Ada said. We're going to document the flow at the mission bell's ring, and we need an official witness to sign our findings. We need your signature on the page. The audacity of the request made Luz's eyebrow rise. To sign that book would be to declare war on Malachi Durn. She would lose her job, at the very least. Mister, Durn is arrogant, Ada pressed, sensing a flicker of interest. He's gotten away with this for so long. He doesn't believe anyone is smart enough or brave enough to catch him. He's not even covering his tracks. He's just taking... Luz stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. She despised Durn's easy, sweating arrogance. She hated the way he dismissed her, the way he treated the law as a minor inconvenience. One night of data is an anomaly, Luz said, turning back. 2 nights is a coincidence. You bring me 3 consecutive nights of identical data that shows the gates opening at the same time, the flow dropping by the same amount, and I will ride out with you on the 4th night. If I see what you see, I will sign my name to your book. She tapped the cover. 3 nights, consistent data, then we talk. They had a witness, but the price was to return to the place of their ambush. 3 more times. They found Ephraim Tull in the sagging wreckage of his shack behind the livery stable, nursing a bottle of whiskey in the morning sun. He was a man in his 60s, his hands palsied, his face a roadmap of broken veins. He had been the lead engineer on the Cactus Line, the man who had first mapped the territory's water. Durn had fired him 5 years ago. Colt Harrow. Ephraim slurred, squinting. Come to look at the town, drunk. I came to talk about the Mesquite Gate, Ephraim, Colt said, his voice gentle. Ephraim's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He paled. I don't know nothing about that. We saw it, Ada said, stepping forward. We saw the wheel mechanism, and we saw the other one, the one hidden in the brush. Get out, Ephraim whispered, his eyes darting around the empty yard. Durn finds you here, He already ruined you, Ephraim, Colt said, not unkindly. Fired you for drunkenness on the job. But we know the truth. You wouldn't do the work he wanted. Ephraim's pride, buried under years of shame and alcohol, sparked. I'm a builder, he hissed. I bring water to the land. I don't drill the cap rock. I told him that vein under the mesquite was unstable. I told him he'd poison the deep aquifer, pull up alkali, but he wouldn't listen. He wanted more. He always wants more. Ada opened her notebook to the map she had drawn. Show me, she said. His shaking finger traced her drawing. The fool, he muttered. He actually did it. It's not just a diversion ditch, girl. He drilled straight down, tapped the deep spring. He's not just stealing our water. He's stealing the mountain's blood. It'll dry up the high springs in a year. Colt's face hardened. The high springs, his last refuge. Will you testify to that? Ada asked. Ephraim looked at his whiskey bottle. They won't believe me. I'm a drunk. They'll believe me, Colt said. And they'll believe her. And they'll believe the other ranchers when they see their own ditches dry up. All we need is for you to stand up and say, I told him not to. Ephraim looked at Ada's map, his old engineer's mind clicking. Your measurements, they're good, but you need more. You need every rancher on the line taking the same measurements at the same time. That Thursday, in a borrowed barn lit by a dozen lanterns, Ada stood before a group of 15 ranchers. They were gaunt, angry, and suspicious. They blamed each other. They blamed the railroad. They blamed the heavens. Ada brought a chalkboard. Mister, Durn is counting on us fighting each other, she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the cavernous space. He knows we're too tired to look, and he assumes we're not smart enough to understand. She drew a simple diagram of the ditch system. He's stealing from us, and we're going to prove it. For an hour, she taught them. She, the barren woman, the outcast, became their teacher. She showed them how to make a notched measuring stick, how to use a weighted string to measure flow. Sister Rowan will ring the mission bell at 9, 10, and 11 o'clock. We all write down the level at the bell. We do not guess. We do not estimate. We write what we see. They were skeptical, but as she spoke, their anger found a new, focused target. They weren't just victims anymore. They were becoming an army of observers. While Ada built her army, Colt played his own long game. The next morning, he began moving his herd. "We can't fight Dern and the drought at the same time," he told Ada. "I'm taking them up to the high pasture. The North Spring is weak, but it's ours. It'll be hard on them, but it takes us off his ditch. When we go to that hearing, I'll be the only man in the room who Dern can't starve out." It was a brutal, pragmatic move, a sacrifice of his herd's health for their legal independence. Ada's notebook was now a web of technical data. It was correct, but it was not persuasive. She needed a story. She found it in Lark, the 16-year-old girl who painted signs for Mara Quill's Mercantile. Lark was a quiet girl with a breathtaking artistic talent. "Lark," Ada said, finding her behind the shop. "I need a map, not a map for engineers, a map for a jury." She showed Lark the notebook. The girl's eyes lit up. He has a secret river." "He does," Ada said. "And I need you to show it to the world. Can you draw what my numbers mean?" Lark took the notebook, her fingers smudging the charcoal. "I can paint it," she said, her voice alive with the thrill of the secret. "I'll use the bright red from the new tobacco ad." The web was tightening. As the ranchers began their nightly measurements, rumors flew. Dern was nervous. He was seen coming and going from the saloon at all hours. Deputy Luce found Ada in the street, her face grim. "It's true," Luce said, her voice low. "Dern hosted a private dinner for Judge Pike last night. I talked to the girl who served them. 3 bottles of French wine, a box of Cuban cigars, and a very friendly game of poker. The judge left with a full wallet." "So he's bought him," Ada said, her heart sinking. "He's tried," Luce corrected. "A judge can't be bought, not officially, but he can be made friendly. It taints the well. I can't testify about water I didn't see, but I can submit a sworn affidavit about 3 bottles of French wine and a private card game the night before a major hearing. It makes the judge look bad, and Judge Pike hates looking bad." The notebook was now the most dangerous object in the territory. Colt and Ada couldn't risk keeping it at the ranch. That evening, they went to the chapel. Father McKinnon was lighting Vesper candles. "Father," Ada said, holding the book, "I believe this contains the truth, and I believe Malachi Dern will stop at nothing to destroy it." The old priest looked at the water-stained, mud-smudged book. He looked at Colt's steady gaze and Ada's unblinking one. "Mister, Dern is a man of appetites," the priest said. "He may not fear God, but he fears the social embarrassment of being known as a man who would steal from God's house." He took the book. "It will be safe," he said, and walked to the small, ornate tabernacle behind the altar. He opened the golden door and placed the notebook inside, next to the holy chalice. That night was the 3rd and final night of measurement, the night they needed to convince Luce. A thunderstorm, the one that had been promised by the wind for days, finally broke. It was not a gentle, life-giving rain. It was a violent, driving deluge. Ada, Colt, and 2 other ranchers, Abner and Josiah, were at the ditch. The mission bell rang for 9 o'clock, lost in the crash of thunder. The ditch was no longer a trickle. It was a raging, muddy torrent. "The stakes!" Abner yelled, pointing. The calibrated, notched measuring sticks they had carefully placed along the bank were being torn loose by the flash flood, their precious, consistent data washing away. There was no discussion, no plan. All 4 of them, as one, plunged into the churning, knee-deep mud and water. They weren't fighting Dern. They were fighting the storm itself. Ada slipped on a slick rock, going down face first into the cold, muddy water. She came up, gasping, spitting mud, her hair plastered to her face, but in her hand, She held one of the stakes. Colt was beside her, soaked to the skin, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. He was holding 2 stakes. He looked at her, his face a mask of mud, a streak of grit on his cheek. He looked at the sky, the pouring rain, the absolute absurd misery of their situation. A low sound rumbled in his chest. It was a chuckle. It burst out of him, a real, unshielded laugh at the sheer impossibility of it all. Ada, seeing him, started to laugh too. It was a high, hysterical, joyous sound. The other 2 ranchers, standing in the flood, holding their own salvaged sticks, joined in. 4 people, laughing like children, covered in mud, in the middle of a thunderstorm, having saved their proof. Back in the cabin, long after midnight, they were drying by the fire. The notebook, retrieved from the chapel, was complete. The data from 3 nights, confirmed by 2 other ranchers, was identical. Ada took something from her small cloth sack. It was the frayed piece of blue ribbon, the last thing she had from her mother. Her hands, clean now, were steady. She carefully tied the ribbon around the mud-stained, water-warped, and now sacred notebook. It was a seal. It was a promise. Colt watched her, the firelight catching the resolve in her profile. She tied the bow, her movements deft and final. "It's time," she said, her voice low and firm, "for my name to stand firm." The court was not held in a building of brick and polished wood, but under a vast canvas tarp stretched between the circuit judge's wagon and the side of the livery stable. It was a temporary cathedral of law, and its congregation was the entire population of Mesquite Ferry. They stood in a tight, silent circle, their boots shuffling in the fine, pale dust that hung in the air, illuminated by the sharp columns of sunlight that pierced the holes in the canvas. The air was thick with the smell of hot canvas, nervous sweat, and the dry, unyielding land itself. Judge Avery Pike sat at a makeshift bench, a long plank laid across 2 barrels, draped with an American flag. His face was a stern, impassive mask, but his eyes, sharp and restless, missed nothing. He was a man caught between the official letter of the law and the unwritten, often more powerful, laws of the frontier. He was acutely aware of the affidavit from Deputy Luce sitting on the corner of his bench, a folded piece of paper that felt heavier than a law book. On one side stood Malachi Dern and his lawyer, a slick, well-fed man from a city far to the east, whose starched collar was already wilting in the oppressive heat. On the other stood Ada, Colt, and Deputy Luce. Ada held her notebook, the worn leather cover and the faded blue ribbon a stark contrast to the sheaf of official-looking documents in the lawyer's hands. The lawyer began, his voice a smooth, condescending balm. "Your Honor, we are here today because of a simple misunderstanding, amplified by the hardships of a difficult season. The Cactus Line Water Company, under the scrupulous leadership of my client, Mr. Dern, operates under a legally granted and fully paid charter from this very territory." He held up a document with an impressive-looking seal. "The simple, tragic fact is that we're in a drought. The land is thirsty. The rivers are low. My client is a businessman, not a rainmaker. This is a case of a lack of rain. Your Honor, not a lack of morals." He waved a dismissive hand toward Ada. "What we have here are the desperate, unfounded accusations of a few struggling ranchers looking for someone to blame for their misfortune." Judge Pike looked at Ada. "Miss Breyer, you have brought this complaint. You may present your evidence." All eyes turned to her. There was a low murmur in the crowd. This was the girl from the Mercantile, the quiet woman who had faced down Mara Quill. She did not look like a revolutionary. She looked like a schoolteacher. Ada stepped forward. She did not speak to the judge. She spoke to the crowd, her voice clear and steady, the voice of someone who had taught a class in a barn. "We are all neighbors. We all drink from the same ditch, and we have all felt it grow weak." She opened her notebook. For 3 consecutive nights, myself and 2 other ranchers, Mr. Abner Crown and Mr. Josiah Finch, measured the water level in our section of the ditch. We marked our measurements at the 9, 10, and 11 o'clock rings of the mission bell. She held up the book, showing the neat columns of numbers. At 9 o'clock, the flow was full. At 10 o'clock, it had dropped by half. By 11, it was a trickle. For 3 nights, the numbers were the same. The water didn't just get low, it was turned off, like a spigot. Dern's lawyer scoffed. Amateur measurements and childish scribbles. Your Honor. Then perhaps a picture would be clearer, Ada said, her gaze unwavering. She nodded to the side. Lark, the sign painter's girl, stepped forward, her face pale with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. She was carrying a large, rolled-up piece of canvas. With the help of Abner, she unrolled it and hung it from the stable wall. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a map, but it was more than a map. It was a story. Lark had painted the entire ditch system in a clean, bright blue. The ranches were marked with simple drawings of barns and cattle. But then, starting from 2 points, one in a thicket of brush, the other beneath a lightning-scarred mesquite tree, 2 thick, ugly arrows of stark, blood-red paint branched off, leading to a large, angry red blotch labeled Dern's Private Reservoir. The red arrows were labeled in stark black letters, Night Flow. It was devastatingly simple. Everyone in that crowd, literate or not, could understand it. It was a picture of a bleeding artery. This is an outrage, Dern's lawyer sputtered. Slanderous fiction. Is it? Ada's voice cut through his. Ephraim Tull, will you please step forward? A shudder went through the crowd as the old town drunk shuffled forward, his hands shaking, his eyes on the dusty ground. Mr. Tull, Ada said, her voice gentle. You were the lead engineer for the Cactus Line for 15 years. Can you tell the court what this is? She pointed to the spot on the map marked by the broken mesquite. Ephraim stared at the map, and for the first time in years, the fog of alcohol seemed to clear from his eyes. He saw not a painting, but a blueprint, a ghost of his own past work. That's the cap rock over the deep spring, he mumbled, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and spoke louder. I told the foreman. You can't drill there, I said. It's unstable. You'll poison the aquifer. It was against my own survey. And what did the foreman say? Ada pressed. Ephraim finally looked up, his gaze finding Malachi Dern's furious face. A spark of his old, defiant self returned. He said, Mr. Dern doesn't care about your survey, old man. He cares about results. He told me to install the sluice gate. A verbal order. He said, no paper. He looked at Judge Pike, his voice ringing with a lifetime of shame. And when I refused, he fired me, said I was drunk on the job. A low, angry growl rumbled through the crowd. They all knew Ephraim was a drunk, but they also knew he had been the best waterman in the territory. Before Dern's lawyer could object, Deputy Luz Ortega stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply placed a single, folded sheet of paper on Judge Pike's bench, right next to his gavel. It was her sworn affidavit. Judge Pike's eyes flickered to the paper. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not need to read it. He knew what it said. It was a detailed account of 3 bottles of French wine and a very lucky night of poker. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the ranchers whose votes he would need next year, at the signed statement on his desk. He was trapped. He cleared his throat. Mr. Harrow, you have not spoken. Do you have anything to add to this proceeding? Colt stepped forward. He was not wearing a hat. His face was fully visible, his gaze as steady and unyielding as the mountains behind him. He looked directly at the judge, but his words were for everyone. We paid for water, he said, his voice low and clear, not for darkness. The sentence, simple and profound, landed in the charged silence. It framed the entire conflict in 2 words, light and dark, honesty and theft. This was the final straw for Malachi Dern. His face, already florid, turned a deep, apoplectic purple. His carefully constructed world of legal papers and backroom deals was being dismantled by a woman's notebook, a girl's painting, and a drunk's memory. His arrogance, his absolute belief in his own power, finally cracked. He lunged forward, shoving his lawyer aside. "This is my town," he roared, his voice shaking with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at the ranchers. "I give you water. I give you life. What I do with the runoff, with the excess, is my business. The day is yours, but the night is mine." The silence that followed his outburst was absolute. The crowd stared, stunned. He had said it. He had confessed. In his rage, he had admitted to the entire scheme. An audible gasp, a wave of sound, swept through the assembled townspeople. Judge Pike's face was like stone. He picked up his gavel. Bang! The sound echoed off the stable wall. "This court is not a saloon. Mr. Dern." The judge's voice was cold iron. "And your proprietary claim to the hours of darkness is not recognized by the laws of this territory." Bang! Based on the consistent, corroborated testimony presented here, this court orders the immediate and temporary sealing of the 2 sluice gates identified on this illustrative map. He glared at Dern. "Deputy Ortega will oversee the work. Furthermore, the Cactus Line Water Company is fined an amount equal to the estimated value of the water diverted over the past 60 days. That fine will be paid not to this court, but into a community fund for the ranchers affected." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. Dern looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "Your Honor," Ada said, her voice cutting through the celebration. The crowd fell silent again. "I ask for one more thing," she said. "A temporary seal can be broken. A fine can be paid and forgotten. We ask that the court order the installation of a public water meter at the main fork of the ditch to be sealed with a community lock. The people will only trust a law they can see." Judge Pike looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. She wasn't just fighting a battle, she was trying to win the war. "A sensible precaution," he ruled. "So ordered." Bang! The hearing was over. The crowd erupted, surging forward, surrounding Ada and Colt, clapping them on the back, shaking their hands. Dern, his face a mask of pure hatred, was shouldered out of the way, his lawyer muttering apologies as they retreated. As the crowd began to disperse, Ada felt Colt's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through her own. She looked up at him, relief washing over her. They had done it. They had won. Then, across the crowded yard, she saw one of Dern's men, the same one who had found her tracks by the ditch. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his horse. He put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a short, sharp whistle. It wasn't a call. It was a signal. The horse didn't even twitch, but another man, standing near the saloon, heard it. He looked over, met the first man's eyes, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The warmth of victory in Ada's chest was instantly chilled. She squeezed Colt's hand, and he looked down at her, seeing the change in her expression. He followed her gaze and saw the silent exchange. He understood immediately. They had won the fight with paper and words. They had used the law like a weapon and brought the giant to his knees. But the law only worked in the daylight, and Malachi Dern had already claimed the night. The legal battle was over. The war was just beginning. The victory in the makeshift courtroom was a fragile thing, a piece of paper in a world where the most binding contracts were still settled with iron and fire. The quiet journey back to the homestead was a tense, watchful passage. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. They did not celebrate. They prepared. Colt cleaned and oiled his rifle. Not the old pistol he had given to Ada, but his working Winchester. Ada refilled every water barrel, every bucket, every spare pot and pan. until the cabin sloshed with their most precious resource. They were a garrison of 2, waiting for a war they knew was coming. It came just after midnight. The first sign was a change in the air. The wind, which had been fitful all evening, grew steady and purposeful, a hot, dry current flowing down from the high, dark spine of Raven Mesa. Then came the smell, faint at first, then stronger, the acrid, unmistakable scent of burning sagebrush. Colt was the first to his feet, already moving toward the door, but it was Ada who saw it. Through the cabin's small window, she saw a flicker of orange against the black silhouette of the mesa, a single, malevolent star, then another, and another, a line of them. "Colt," she whispered, her voice tight with a cold, terrifying certainty. He looked, and his face hardened into a mask of grim understanding. The line of stars bloomed, merging into a single, growing ribbon of fire, an orange serpent unzipping the dark. Dern's men had lit the dry grass at the top of the mesa. The wind was doing the rest, pushing a solid wall of flame directly down the slope, directly toward their homestead. There was no time for discussion. Colt was already pulling on his boots, grabbing his heavy work gloves, but Ada ran past him, not to the water barrels, but to the gate. She grabbed the rope for the small brass bell she had hung there and pulled, not in a gentle ring, but in a frantic, desperate clang, 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 clang. It was a tiny, tinny sound against the vast, hungry crackle of the approaching fire, a sound that seemed hopeless, a sound that would be swallowed by the wind. But it was not. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a single light flickered to life in the distance, down the path toward Mesquite Ferry. Then another, and another. Her desperate, tiny alarm had been heard. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, consuming the dry grass with a sound like tearing canvas. It was no longer a line. It was a roaring, churning wave, the color of a furious sunset, casting a demonic, dancing light across the entire valley. Colt was already in the corral, throwing a saddle on his steadiest horse, a big blue roan named, simply, Blue. He didn't grab his rifle. He hitched the horse to the heavy braking plow. From the town, they came. Not a cavalry charge, but a shambling, determined army of neighbors. They came on foot and in wagons, their faces grim in the hellish orange glow. Abner and Josiah, the ranchers who had stood with them, were at the front, carrying shovels. The blacksmith, his massive arms bare, carried 2 empty water buckets in each hand. Men and women, their faces smudged with sleep, carried wet blankets, grain sacks, hose, anything that could beat or smother a flame. It was a spontaneous, desperate militia, summoned by a woman's bell. Colt gave a sharp command to Blue, and the horse, trained to pull against the unyielding earth, leaned into its harness. The plow blade bit deep into the dry soil, carving a dark, wide scar in the path of the fire. He was creating a firebreak, a desperate, last-ditch line of defense. Sparks and burning embers rained down around him, some landing on his canvas coat, burning small, smoking holes. He didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the plow handles, his entire being focused on the line of dark, defensible earth he was tearing from the land. Ada met the townsfolk as they arrived. Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the roar of the fire and the rising panic. "Women to the well. Form a line, men with shovels. With Colt widen that break blankets here." She was no longer a victim or a refugee. She was a field general, her face illuminated by the approaching apocalypse, her authority absolute and unquestioned. The women, from Sister Rowan in her soot-stained habit to the wives of the ranchers who had once scorned her, formed a human chain from the well to the fire line. The buckets moved from hand to hand, a desperate, sloshing rhythm. They dipped their own coats and skirts into the precious water, and under Ada's direction, they began to beat at the smaller fires that jumped the plow line, their movements becoming a desperate, percussive heartbeat against the skin of the earth. Moss, The old dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment better than anyone. As the families arrived, he didn't bark at the fire. He moved among the children, nudging them, herding them with a low, insistent whine, guiding the small, terrified flock away from the chaos and up the small hill toward the one place he seemed to know was safe, the distant, stone-walled mission chapel. He was saving the future. But Dern's plan had more than one vector. As the main fire raged, Ada saw a flicker of movement near the irrigation ditch. It was one of Dern's men, the one who had signaled his partner at the trial. He was at the newly sealed sluice gate, a heavy crowbar in his hands, trying to pry open the lock. If he succeeded, he would drain the ditch, and the well that was their only hope would run dry in minutes. Ada shouted, pointing, "The ditch! He's at the gate!" Deputy Luz Ortega, who had arrived with the first of the townsfolk, her pistol already drawn, saw it too. Together, they ran, leaving the fire line, their feet slipping in the mud created by the spilled water from the bucket brigade. They reached the man just as he managed to break the lock. He gave a triumphant grunt and put his shoulder to the heavy gate. Ada and Luz hit him at the same time. It was not a graceful fight. It was a desperate scuffle in the slick, greasy mud, illuminated by the monstrous fire. The man was strong, fueled by desperation and Dern's pay. He shoved Luz back, and she slipped, her pistol flying from her grasp and vanishing into the murky water. He swung the crowbar at Ada, who dodged, her foot sliding out from under her. She fell backward, her arms flailing. She was on the very edge of the newly plowed fire break. Just a few feet behind her, a section of the grass had caught, and a wall of flames, 6 feet high, was licking at the air. The heat was a physical blow, scorching her skin, stealing the breath from her lungs. She saw the man raise the crowbar again, his face a demonic mask in the firelight. This was it. This was the end. A sound cut through the roar. It was the thunder of hoofbeats, and a horse and rider exploded out of the smoke and chaos. It was Colt, on Blue. He had seen her fall. He didn't slow. He galloped Blue directly between Ada and the flames, the horse's body a living shield against the searing heat, in one fluid, powerful motion. He leaned down from the saddle, his arm shooting out. He grabbed Ada by the front of her dress, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, hauled her up and onto the saddle in front of him, pulling her away from the fire just as it surged forward, consuming the very spot where she had lain. The henchman stared, his jaw agape at the impossible. Heroic sight. It was all the time Luz needed. She lunged, tackling him at the knees, driving him face first into the mud. From the saddle, Ada saw another figure, trying to use the chaos as cover to flee. Malachi Dern himself, his fine city clothes smeared with soot, was scrambling through a narrow ravine, trying to get to a horse he had hidden there. Colt, it's him. Colt needed no other encouragement. He spurred Blue, and the big horse, sensing the urgency, leaped the ditch and charged after the fleeing man. They cornered Dern in the rocky crevice. He turned, his face a mask of terror and impotent rage, trapped like a rat. Luz was right behind them, dragging the mud-caked henchman. She shoved him to the ground and advanced on Dern. There were no words. She grabbed his wrist, bent his arm back until he shrieked in pain, and with a length of rein Colt tossed down to her. She expertly hog-tied his hands behind his back. And then something changed. A collective gasp went up from the fire line. The wind, their relentless enemy, the hot, dry engine of Dern's vengeance, had faltered. It swirled, eddies of smoke and ash dancing in confusion. Then, with a great, sighing moan that seemed to come from the mountain itself, it shifted. It began to blow from the east. The great wall of fire, which had been pressing down on the homestead, slowed, then stopped, and then, with terrifying speed, it began to move in the other direction. It turned back on itself, a serpent consuming its own tail, and began racing up the slope, back toward the land Dern had so carefully prepared. the land he had likely doused with oil to ensure a fast, hot burn. Justice, it seemed, had a mind of its own. A great ragged cheer went up from the exhausted, soot-covered firefighters. And then, a second miracle. A drop of water hit Ada's cheek, then another, and another. The sky, which had been a hellish orange, was now a deep, bruised purple. A light, hesitant rain began to fall, hissing as it hit the hot ground and the glowing embers. It wasn't a deluge, but it was enough. The cheer from the crowd became a roar, a wild, primal sound of relief and triumph that mingled with a low rumble of distant thunder. In the midst of the celebration, on the back of the heaving, sweat-soaked horse, Colt pulled Ada closer. She turned in the saddle, her arms going around his neck, her muddy, tear-streaked face pressed against his. He held her tight, his hand buried in her tangled, damp hair. He looked down at her, his face a mask of soot and fierce, protective love. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dying flames. There were no words. There was no need for them. They leaned in, their foreheads touching. A silent, profound communion of two souls who had walked through the fire and found each other on the other side. The soft rain fell on them like a blessing, washing away the ash, baptizing them in their victory. At that moment, a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire scene for a split second in a flash of stark, white light. And in that flash, it revealed a new addition to the homestead. Earlier that day, before the chaos, Colt had hammered a rough-hewn, hand-painted sign into the ground near the gate, a direct answer to the shame of the auction block, a defiant flag planted in his own soil. In the stark, instantaneous light of the heavens, the black-painted letters stood out against the raw wood, a testament that was seen by the entire town, a creed for their new life. It read, "Not for sale." The dawn that broke over Dry Willow Ridge was unlike any the valley had ever seen. The air, washed clean by the rain and the fire, was sharp and clear. The rising sun illuminated a landscape scarred by black soot, but also blessed with the dark, damp promise of freshly fallen rain. The fire was out. A new day had begun. By mid-morning, the entire town had gathered again, not under the tense canvas of a temporary court, but in the open air before the newly sealed sluice gate. The mood was not one of jubilation, but of quiet, sober resolution. Judge Avery Pike was there, his face grim. The events of the previous night had spread like wildfire, and he knew his own reputation now hung in the balance, tied inextricably to the bottle of French wine and the poker game mentioned in Luz Ortega's affidavit. He was no longer a man who could be bought. He was a man desperate to prove he was incorruptible. With a flourish of his pen that was both a legal act and a public performance of his own integrity, he signed the official order. It declared the temporary seizure of Malachi Dern's private reservoir, placing its contents under the management of a newly formed community water trust. The scratch of his pen on the heavy paper was the only sound, a sound of a new law being written, a power being broken. Deputy Luz Ortega, her uniform clean but her eyes still weary, led Dern forward. He was not in chains, but her hand rested firmly on his arm. His fine suit was torn and smeared with mud, his face a pasty, unshaven mask of disbelief. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a defeated man. "It was the drought," he mumbled, his voice a hoarse whisper. "To anyone and no one. A man has to protect his own. It was just business." The crowd did not jeer. They did not shout. They were as silent as the stones of the mesa. Their silence was a judgment more profound and absolute than any verdict. It was the silence of a community that had seen the truth and had turned its back on a liar. They simply watched as Luz led him to a wagon that would take him to the county seat to await a more formal trial. In the quiet that followed his departure, Ada stepped into the center of the circle. She was not holding a weapon or a legal document. She was holding a single sheet of paper, a page torn from her own notebook. In her clear, steady hand, She had written out a list. "This is for the new trust," she announced, her voice carrying in the clean air. "The community water rules." She handed the paper to Abner Crown, the oldest rancher. He held it up for all to see. There were 10 rules, written not in the convoluted language of lawyers, but in the simple, direct language of the land. 1. The water belongs to the ditch, and the ditch belongs to us all. 2. We will measure once at sunrise and once at sunset, every day. 3. The community lock will have 3 keys, one for the deputy, one for the mission, and one for the rancher's trust. 4. No single man shall divert more than his household's share in a time of drought. 5. We will forgive old debts, but we will not forget the truth. The list went on. A simple, powerful constitution born of necessity and written by a woman they had once dismissed. It was their Declaration of Independence. Colt, saying nothing, stepped forward with a new gate mechanism he and the blacksmith had forged through the night. It was heavy, solid iron, with no place for a hidden lever. As he set it into place, sealing the ditch with a definitive clang of metal on stone, Abner stepped up to help him, then Josiah, then another man and another. Hands reached out, helping to set the posts, to tighten the bolts. It was no longer Colt's fence. It was no longer Dern's ditch. It was our water. It was our gate. From the edge of the crowd, 2 figures watched. The first was Mara Quill. She looked diminished, her usual sharp-edged confidence gone, replaced by a nervous, uncertain energy. She had built her power on whispers and innuendo, and the fire had burned that power to ash. Ada saw her. She left Colt's side and walked directly toward the woman who had tried to humiliate her. Mara flinched, expecting an accusation, a public shaming. Ada stopped a few feet from her. Her face was calm, her voice devoid of malice. "Mrs. Quill," she said, her voice so quiet only Mara could hear it. "Your needle is sharp. It can sew a fine shirt, but it can't sew a person's mouth shut, and it can't mend a reputation that's been torn by your own words." Mara's face crumpled. She looked down at her own hands, the tools of her trade, as if seeing them for the first time. Without a word, she turned and hurried away, a woman finally silenced by the truth. The second figure was her uncle, Jedediah. He had been drawn by the commotion, his face a mixture of fear and craven opportunism. He shuffled forward, trying to manufacture a smile. "Ada, my girl," he began, his voice slick. "I heard what you did. A brave thing. Family should stick together. Perhaps it's time we put the past behind us." Ada looked at the man who had put her on an auction block. She felt no anger, only a profound, weary pity. Her voice was as soft as the rain had been, but as hard as the stones of the well. "Family," she said, "starts when you stop selling each other." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. The false smile vanished. He saw not a niece to be exploited, but a woman made of iron and fire. He took a step back, then another, and then he turned and scuttled away, disappearing into the crowd, a ghost exorcised by a quiet, simple truth. The last of the old debts had been paid. Deputy Luz Ortega came to stand before her. In her hand, she held a small tin star, not her official badge, but a smaller, honorary one. "The town council, what's left of it, voted this morning," Luz said, her usual stoicism warmed by a genuine, rare smile. "This doesn't come with a gun or a salary. It has no power. It's just a thank you, from all of us, for reminding us what the law is supposed to be for." She pinned the small, cool star to Ada's dress. It was a small weight, but it felt as heavy and significant as a foundation stone. The crowd began to drift away, back to their homes, back to their lives, leaving the new gate and the new rules to stand as silent sentinels. Soon, it was just Ada and Colt, standing by the quiet, now full ditch. The windmill on the ridge turned in the steady breeze, its familiar, gentle squeak, a song of peace. He looked at her, at the small, tin star on her dress, at the quiet strength in her eyes. He had no words for the feeling that was cresting inside him, a feeling as powerful and life-giving as the water now flowing in the ditch. So he used the only language he knew. He walked to the cabin and stood on the porch, in the exact spot where they had sat on that first, quiet evening. He looked at her, and then, with a slow, deliberate reverence, he took off his wide-brimmed hat. He held it for a moment, then bent and placed it on the top step, the same place he had set it down on the night that had changed everything. He laid down his armor. He laid down his solitude. And then he straightened up, his face open to the sun, his eyes asking the one question that still remained. Ada's heart gave a single, powerful thud. She walked to him, up the steps, until she was standing before him. The faint, clean scent of soot and rain still clung to his clothes. She raised her hand and laid her palm flat against his cheek, the rough stubble a familiar, comforting texture. She felt the warmth of his skin, the lifeblood of the man who had stood between her and the fire. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally try and find the words. She put a finger to his lips, just as she had before. A slow smile touched her own. "Don't speak," she whispered, her voice husky with all the emotion of the past days. "Just feel." He let out a shuddering breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and his arms went around her, pulling her in. They clung to each other, a quiet, desperate embrace of homecoming. The whole town, from their porches and their windows, saw. A smattering of applause broke out, a ragged, heartfelt cheer for the two solitary souls who had saved them all. And then, as if by some unspoken, collective agreement, the applause faded, the doors closed. The town gave them the gift of privacy, leaving them alone in their own world. His hand was on her back, his calloused, working man's hand, holding her with a strength that was fierce and a tenderness that was heartbreaking. She was safe. She was home. They closed their eyes, their foreheads touching, two halves of a single prayer finally answered. At that moment, from the well, a single, clear note rang out as a bucket was lowered for the first time since the fire. The sound hung in the clean, bright air, a sound of renewal. And from the ditch, the new, full stream of water, released by the community gate, surged forward. It washed over the rocks, clear and bright and strong, a liquid testament flowing through the veins of the land, a promise kept, love and justice, finding their course at the exact same time. Ada smiled, a real, radiant smile, her face pressed against his chest. His hat rested on the step, a silent, surrendered king. And in the bright morning sun, the hand-painted sign by the gate stood as a final, defiant declaration of all they had won. Not for sale. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.